Okay, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Diane Moore, Director of the Religious Literacy Project. She is Senior Lecturer on Religious Studies and Education and the Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. Dr. Moore, I am now going to stop sharing my screen and you can begin to share yours so that you can begin your presentation. Oh, let me unmute you too. Hold on. There you are. Once more. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. I want to thank you for this kind invitation and to say hello to all of you. I'm really grateful to be with you, and thanks for taking the time out of what I'm sure is a crazy schedule. And also, I'm just excited to learn about this program. I think it's a fabulous program and a really important one for reasons that I hope will be clear as I move through my presentation. So let me just let me go ahead and start by getting this into the proper mode here. Hold on. So, Tiffany, can everyone see now my PowerPoint?
No, we're still seeing you. So make sure you've clicked on share screen and chosen your window from the bottom menu.
Hold on. Sorry, everybody.
No worries.
I'm used to these webinars, but this one's new for me. Okay, here we go. There.
We're a very flexible bunch here.
I'm sure you are. I'm sure you are. Okay, so now let me try it. How's that? Can you see now?
Oh, we're still seeing you. We do know
okay,
that you can do it, though.
So I see. So share screen. How's that?
There we go. Perfect.
There we go. Great. Okay. So before I start, I just want to say a couple things about what I think is a really challenging role that you as journalists have in this arena of religious literacy. First of all, I think that there are primarily three places where people learn about religion in our context, and I would say this actually extends to other parts of the globe as well, but we'll speak specifically here in the U.S. context. The three places are one's own religious communities, if one is religious, or none, so one's family of origin, and opinions about religion are always present, no matter what your worldview is. The second is the media and journalism. And the third is education. And we don't do a whole lot with education around better understanding of religion, but that's the place that I focus much of my work over the last 2 decades, actually, has been working with teachers. So you all are in the front lines of this. And I always say people in the religious studies profession often will be frustrated with the role of the way religion is represented in media coverage. And I'm always anxious about that, because I feel like journalists, like everyone else in our context and in our culture, haven't really necessarily had exposure to what I'm calling a more responsible, sophisticated understanding of religion that would be required for you to do better work, according to people who are critical of you, around religion, because again, you're part of a cultural context that does not really offer very many opportunities for people to learn about religion beyond simplistic representations of ritual belief and practice that is sometimes covered in schools. So, and then, or the other option, which is through your own devotional expression, and I'll talk about the tensions around that perspective in a moment. So anyway, I just want to say that I'm really grateful to, again, have this opportunity to work with you and to talk with you and to learn from you, I hope, through the discussion, what particular challenges you're facing as young journalists around these fields and what might be helpful beyond what I'm going to present today. I hope this will be helpful, but I'm eager to engage in and establish relationships with professionals around what kind of challenges they're facing in coverage of religion or understanding religion in your own fields. I know, because I've talked with many of you in the profession about some of those challenges, and much of what I'm going to present today is in response to journalists talking about the issues that they face. So you're going to hear from me today, not a comprehensive view of any world religion. I hope that's not what you're expecting. I suspect it isn't. But I'm going to be introducing you to the most preliminary foundations of a method for how to understand religion that I've been working on in my own scholarship for the last several years, and also that we're promoting through the Religious Literacy Project, which I direct. So I'm going to start with assumptions, and then I'll move into basic definitions of religious literacy, illiteracy, give you some examples of common ways of the ways that illiteracy is reproduced in our cultural context. Then I'm going to show 2 clips that are representatives of problematic journalistic representations of religion that will, again, mirror many of the common assumptions or representations of what I call illiteracy about religion. Let me say at the outset that I have no intention here of showing these clips for us to sit back in a smug way and say, oh, how silly or stupid or anything about those journalists. I actually have a lot of sympathy for them because, again, I think that their representations are common, that I see this kind of representation about religion, not just in journalism, but in all fields from many, many people that have a very sophisticated view of many other issues. But when it comes to religion, there often is a blind spot around the complexity of religion, which, again, will be demonstrated in these 2 videos. So I'm not showing them to be smug or to be judgmental or to be simplistic, but rather to say this is how deep-seated these challenges are, and to just give you an example of them. And then some suggestions about how we might move forward to minimize that type of representation. And I think it's about a journey. It's not about getting it right the first time, because, again, like anything related to issues of complexity, you can learn about that there's a problem first, and then learning how to better understand that problem and then mitigate it is a process. So with that in mind, let's get started. So I want to first talk about how now my screen seems to be frozen. It's not moving forward. Let me see. Okay, I guess we'll go that way, although I'm sorry, it's going to be a little awkward. So I want to start with the 3 premises that I do that inform my own work, so you know the context out of which I come. First of all, I say that there's widespread illiteracy about religion, and I say that actually spans the globe. I've had occasion to work with teachers and now, in some more modest context, journalists in many parts of the world: Pakistan, Indonesia, India, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and Malaysia. And I was struck at the similarities around assumptions about religion in all those contexts. And one of the ways that I understand that is beyond our conversation today, but it is one of the manifestations of the legacies of colonialism that we see some of these same consistencies. So I say that this notion of illiteracy about religion that spans the globe is widespread. So the second premise is that there are many consequences to this that I think are really problematic. And the ones that I'm most concerned about are the civic consequences, because it's the civic consequences that I think are wreaking havoc around a lack of understanding about religion. And I'm asserting that a lack of understanding fuels prejudice and bigotry and hinders cooperative endeavors in local, national, and global arenas, because people unwittingly often reproduce assumptions about religion, simplistic assumptions about religion that are, even if they're stereotypes that are positive, limit our understanding or capacity to understand this really critical power in human experience. Now I just lost there we go. Sorry. So the third premise is that we can, I cut it out. The third premise is that we can better understand religion. If we can promote a better understanding of religion, we can limit or minimize this lack of understanding about religion. And that is really, again, a critical role that journalists can play. So definitions of illiteracy about religion. A lack of understanding about the diversity of expressions and beliefs within traditions that emerge in differing social historical contexts. And then second, the profound role that religion plays in human social, cultural, and political life in contemporary and historical context. So you'll note that I'm not saying that religious literacy is about tenets or beliefs about religion itself, which is often a way we learn about religion. And is in fact one of the ways that this language of religious literacy is quite widely used, that we need to better understand the Four Noble Truths or the five pillars. I think those are important, and I don't want to minimize those, but that's not actually what I'm most concerned about. I'm most concerned about this method, this way to understand the historical specificity and social context out of which diverse religious expressions arise. So with that, religious literacy, its opposite, or mirror twin, entails the ability to discern and analyze the fundamental intersections of religion and social, political, cultural life through multiple lenses. So specifically, a religiously literate person will possess, they'll possess a basic understanding of the history, central texts, where applicable, beliefs, practices, and contemporary manifestations of several of the world's religious traditions. But the second part of this is really what I want to emphasize. As they arose out of and continue to be shaped by particular social, historical, and cultural contexts. So again, this dynamic dimension, this complex dimension is what I'm interested in making sure that we understand around religious literacy. And then second, the ability to discern and explore the religious dimensions of political, social, cultural expressions across time and place. In teaching, and sometimes now also in journalism, we only talk about religion when religion is the front and center topic, or when it's perceived to be the front and center topic. The way to understand religion through the method that I'm about ready to introduce you to assumes that religion is always present. It's always present in social, cultural context. And if we ask the religion question, we'll see dynamics and dimensions that we might not otherwise see. And I equate this then with the same way that we now have learned finally to understand race, ethnicity studies, gender, sexuality studies. That again, it's a lens into complex human forces that if we ask the race lens or the ethnicity lens or the gender lens, the gender question, we then see different things that are relevant in any story, any cultural context. So I'm promoting that religion is similar in that regard. So quickly, simple examples of religious illiteracy. And remember these because they'll be, sadly, many of them will be manifest in the clips that I'm about ready to show you. So religious traditions are represented as internally uniform and static as opposed to diverse and evolving. That's very common. And anytime you hear someone say, well, Buddhists believe, Hindus believe, Muslims are like this, Christians are like this, we say that all the time, and we represent it all the time, and it's problematic. Not only intellectually problematic, but again, it creates these simplistic potential for binaries that end up often being used in ways that divide as opposed to unite us. Second, religious traditions are represented as wholly positive or wholly negative. So you'll hear this debate often. When we have people representing a religious belief that we don't like, and ISIL and ISIS is currently very common in the news now, we often might hear that say, well, that's not representing Islam. They are not Islamic. That's not Islam. Because Islam is a religion of peace, which is the opposite end of that. So we have on the one hand, Islam is a religion of terror and violence. And on the other hand, we have this debate, Islam is a religion of peace. We can have that debate, by the way, in any religious tradition. We often hear about Buddhists as well. Buddhist is a religion of peace, nonviolence, is a common association that we make about Buddhists. So the key here is what we're, from this approach, we're saying actually religion isn't positive or negative in any consistent way. Religion is a very powerful force and can be used and is used to promote a full range of crimes, of acts of human agency, from heinous crimes against humanity to some of the most compassionate, remarkable feats of courage, compassion, and heart that we know of. And so religion isn't a positive or negative force. It is a powerful force that can be used to justify this whole large range. So again, an example of illiteracy is to make the claim that Islam is a religion of peace, or Islam is a religion of terror, or Christianity is a religion of peace, or Christianity is a religion of terror. Any of those are problematic assumptions from this perspective and hinder our ability to understand the complexities. Religions are deeply and nearly exclusively equated with sectarianism. So you'll often hear comments about, well, what you can't, why would you be interested in a particular, why am I teaching about religion? The assumption that any teaching about religion is always about proselytizing or promoting a particular religious viewpoint. And that is a very common association. And we don't make the distinction that I'll be drawing shortly between the distinction between a devotional expression of a religious worldview, which is appropriate for people of faith in all contexts, the distinction between recognizing the legitimacy of those individual devotional assertions, and then the study of diverse devotional assertions, which is the study of religion and the factual truth about religions themselves, which are that they are remarkably diverse. So again, from a journalist perspective, the importance of recognizing and not equating a particular theological assertion with the truth about the religion is a really important role that you all can play. That alone, if you can make that distinction explicit in stories you write, that would do a tremendous amount to minimize this association of religious belief with truth about the religious tradition itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. A fourth example is that, similar to this last one I just spoke about, religious practitioners and leaders are assumed to be experts of their tradition. So often we'll go to religious practitioners or leaders to get their opinion about some related dimension of their religious expression as they manifest themselves in contemporary news cycles or contemporary issues around the world. We also often will see this on commentaries. We'll have people who are representing, again, you'll get a religious leader on a news story to comment on a particular set of questions. It happens all the time in classrooms where teachers will often, with good intentions, ask when they get to the Islam unit, you find the local imam to come speak to the class about what it means to be Islam and Muslim and Islam and Islamic in this context. So the problem with this representation is that, again, religious leaders and religious practitioners are themselves trained in a particular theological or devotional understanding of the tradition and won't, by training anyway, they may also be religious studies scholars or study religion from a religious studies perspective, but their training as religious leaders is not geared toward equipping them to understand the legitimacy and the diversity of expressions outside of their own training. So if it's really clear in our Christian context here in the US, if you've got one day and you're teaching about Christianity, are you going to invite the Roman Catholic priest? Are you going to invite the Quaker? Are you going to invite the Presbyterian minister? Are you going to invite the Mormon lay leader? I mean, who's going to represent Christianity? And any one of those, based on their religious experiences, would be able to speak about out of their own particular theological perspective, but they would not necessarily have exposure to, and certainly not necessarily a sympathetic exposure to, the richness and diversity of Christianity outside of their own tradition. So this association of religious practitioners as experts of the tradition is problematic, and we see it reproduced all the time. And then finally, religions assumed to be a private matter are not appropriately relevant to the public sphere. This gets back to that other question about how religions are embedded. And we often assume that, well, especially here in the US, the misunderstanding of the First Amendment is often that religion has no place in public life or no appropriate place in public life. Not only is that a misunderstanding of the First Amendment, but it's unrealistic to think that religions are actually ever isolated in a private sphere of assumption and existence. And in fact, that notion that religion is a private affair is itself a manifestation of the embeddedness of religious influence, because that's a very Protestant understanding of religion that now permeates a cultural norm that makes even the notion that religion is a private affair separate from political, social, cultural life, that even makes that a legitimate assumption that people might be able to embrace. So the religions are never isolated. That's both an intellectual and a social fiction, but the notion about it is very deeply embedded, and one of the manifestations then, as I say, of illiteracy about religion. Okay, so we've got two clips I'm going to show you here. They happen to be both Reza Aslan, who's a scholar of religion in I think he's still at Riverside in University of California, Riverside. Again, he's one of the people that people call on in the news to represent religion, so that's not uncommon that he would be part of both of these clips. They're separate clips. Some of you may already know these examples, and again, they're particularly, I think, egregious examples, but not uncommon. They're just, and they got a lot of press, so you might well, again, already be familiar with them. But I want to show them to you. I'm going to show basically almost the full 9 minutes of the first one. So bear with me on it, and just pay attention to the dynamics, all the dynamics, including Reza's answers to some questions, because there's some issues I know that he also is struggling with what it means to try to communicate these ideas. And then I'm going to show you just a very short clip of the second one, just at the very beginning. But keep in mind just what I just talked about representations of religious illiteracy. And then following this, I'm going to give you some tools to be able to say, well, what if we had these tools in mind, we might have been able to minimize this sort of potential representation of religion. So I hope this works. I'm going to send you here now. And wait, here we go. Yeah. Okay, good.
Hello, Dr. Moore.
Yes.
The sound isn't coming through on the video. I think it's connected to your headset.
Well, that's a waste of time then. Hold on a second here. Hold on one second. So what do I need to do to make this work then?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Maybe try disconnecting your headset and playing the video, and then perhaps that'll work.
Yeah, and then let me start again then, if that's the case.
Yeah, but
so does that work?
That's actually empirically, factually incorrect.
Yes. The sound is very low, though.
You can hear it?
90% female.
Yes, but the sound is very low.
Okay.
A 75% female genital mutilation. It's a Christian.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Nowhere else.
All right, everybody, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to go ahead and restart this because I think it's an important video. Is that okay? I'm just going to do that. Okay, and apologies. Thanks for letting me know.
Defenders of Islam insist it is a peaceful religion. Others disagree and point to the primitive treatment in Muslim countries of women and other minorities.
So let's discuss this now. We're joined now by Reza Aslan, a scholar of religions, professor at the University of California, Riverside, and the author of Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Let's talk about this because it's a very interesting conversation every time we have it. Before we get into this discussion, I want to play for you this clip from Bill Maher's show just this Friday night. Here it is.
President Obama keeps insisting that ISIS is not Islamic. Well, maybe they don't practice the Muslim faith the same way he does. But if vast numbers of Muslims across the world believe, and they do, that humans deserve to die for merely holding a different idea or drawing a cartoon or writing a book or eloping with the wrong person, not only does the Muslim world have something in common with ISIS, it has too much in common with ISIS. There's so much talk. You can applaud.
He went on for a good 5 or 6 minutes about that, talking about how women are circumcision for women, not respecting the rights of women, not respecting the rights of gay people. And what's your reaction? And then we'll talk.
Well, I like Bill Maher. I've been on the show a bunch of times. He's a comedian, but frankly, when it comes to the topic of religion, he's not very sophisticated in the way that he thinks. I mean, the argument about the female genital mutilation being an Islamic problem is a perfect example of that. It's not an Islamic problem, it's an African problem.
Well, wait, because he says it's a, hold on a second, because he says it's a Muslim country problem. He says that in Somalia.
Yeah, but and that's actually empirically, factually incorrect. It's a Central African problem. Eritrea has almost 90% female genital mutilation. It's a Christian country. Ethiopia has 75% female genital mutilation. It's a Christian country. Nowhere else in the Muslim majority states is female genital mutilation an issue. But again, this is the problem, is that you make these facile arguments like that women are somehow mistreated in the Muslim world. Well, that's certainly true in many Muslim majority countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. Do you know that Muslims have elected 7 women as their heads of states in those Muslim majority countries? How many women do we have as heads of states in the United States?
Reza, be honest though, for the most part, it is not a free and open society for women in those states.
Well, it's not in Iran. It's not in Saudi Arabia. It certainly is in Indonesia and Malaysia. It certainly is in Bangladesh. It certainly is in Turkey. I mean, again, this is the problem, is that you're talking about a religion of 1.5 billion people, and certainly it becomes very easy to just simply paint them all with a single brush by saying, well, in Saudi Arabia, they can't drive, and so therefore that's somehow representative of Islam. It's representative of Saudi Arabia. In Iran, they don't have...
I mean, I think that Bill Maher's point is that these aren't extremists. We often talk about extremists and that we should crack down on extremists. And why aren't Muslims speaking out about extremists? In Saudi Arabia, when women can't vote and they can't drive and they need permission from their husband, that's not extremists. Why aren't we talking more about what? That's not extremist, that's commonplace. Why don't we talk more about the commonplace wrongs that are happening in some of these countries?
It's extremist when compared to the rights and responsibilities of women, Muslim women around the world. It's an extremist way of dealing with it.
But it's not extremist in that, country, in Saudi Arabia. That's the norm.
Oh, no, it's not. I mean, look, Saudi Arabia is one of the most, if not the most extremist Muslim country in the world. In the month that we've been talking about ISIS and their terrible actions in Iraq and Syria, Saudi Arabia, our closest ally, has beheaded 19 people. Nobody seems to care about that because Saudi Arabia sort of preserves our national interests.
Okay.
This is the problem, is that these kinds of conversations that we're having aren't really being had in any kind of legitimate way. We're not talking about women in the Muslim world. We're using 2 or 3 examples to justify a generalization. That's actually the definition of bigotry.
All right, fair enough. Let's listen to Benjamin Netanyahu at the United Nations today.
Okay, everybody, I'm trying to now get out of my screen and bring us to the next example. That seems to be freezing up a little. Here we go. I want to bring us to the next example. I cut that a little short just because we were late. So the next example, again, is a really brief, I'm just going to show a brief clip here. And this was also related to Reza Aslan, and it's in relationship to a new book that he published at the time called Zealot. And this is from Fox News, and this is Lauren Green, who, by the way, is the religion correspondent for Fox News.
Well, Reza Aslan was a Christian, but converted back to the faith of his forefathers. It's Islam. He has now written a book about Jesus. The book has become controversial as
How did this let him?
Wow. This is very frustrating too. Yeah, I think it's something that happens when this is working with my screen. I'm gonna not go there, and we're gonna continue on. Let me tell you what that example was, however. So Lauren Green, and you might get a chance to look at this after the fact, started the interview by asking Reza why he would be interested in Jesus because he is a Muslim. And he proceeded to try to be a little taken aback and say, well, I'm a religious studies scholar. I've got a Ph.D. in this. I'm fluent in Greek. I've been studying Jesus for a long time. And she continually kept asking him, basically, why are you interested in this? And do you think you have a right to write about this when you're not a Christian? And it was a really, again, painful example of assumptions that are driving, deeply embedded assumptions, again, that drive these kinds of discourses. So I'm going to go on now, and I want to share with you these 4 fundamental tenets of it's not just religious studies, although these are fundamental to religious studies, that are, again, ways to think about religion, to keep in mind as we think about how to better understand the complex roles that religions are playing, not, again, just in contemporary life, but historically as well, just how to understand religions. So the first one I mentioned earlier, it's really critical to make a distinction between the devotional expression of a religion and the study of diverse devotional expressions, and not to conflate the two, which we often do. And this last clip that I just explained to you that I didn't get a chance to show you was, again, a conflation of that. It's like, how could you study religion if you're not yourself a Christian? How could you write a book about Christianity? So that conflation ends up being the heart of a lot of issues that lead to misrepresenting religion. The second and third are somewhat self-evident, but they really bear repeating because we don't practice them. That religions are, again, internally diverse. They're not static and uniform, and they're not just internally diverse in terms of different sects within a religious tradition. Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Sunni, Shia, Islam. They're internally diverse even within particular communities of faith. And they're certainly internally diverse across historical, cultural, and social contexts. So again, if you remember, the definition of religious literacy is about understanding religion in its context, recognizing that religions are living traditions, they're ideological understandings that are shaped and are shaped by one's social context. And so diversity is really critical here. And the diversity isn't only about different expressions or interpretations of fundamental tenets of the tradition. The diversity will span the entire range of assumptions about whatever contemporary issue we're wondering about today. So that whole clip about Muslims are oppose women, Islam is against women. It's not supportive of GLBTQ peoples. It's a violent religion. All of those are just not only blanketly false statements, but the fact that they are even accepted in a public context speaks to the depth of these assumptions. So that the diversity of a tradition within Roman Catholicism, for example, where we know that the official stance of the church is against abortion and contraception, there are many, many Roman Catholics, not just here in the US, but across the globe, who are explicitly challenging that theological position of the church from the position of being Roman Catholic, and using their theology of Roman Catholicism and experiences of Roman Catholicism to challenge that particular theological interpretation of the tradition. Similarly, a very unfortunately little known fact is that the Southern Baptists, who are contemporary as many of you know here in the US, very strongly opposed to abortion and at the forefront of many of the public challenges to the legitimacy, moral legitimacy of abortion. In the early 1970s and into the 1980s, the Southern Baptist Convention passed several resolutions that actually supported the moral legitimacy of abortion under certain circumstances, including the health and well-being of the mother, and in situations of rape or incest. So this speaks to the third tenet here, that religions evolve and change. They're not static entities, and that Southern Baptist Convention example is a really good example in that regard. And it doesn't diminish the legitimacy of the Southern Baptist positions in their contemporary representations. It just recognizes and reminds us, first of all, that the Southern Baptists have not been uniform even about this topic that they're presenting as so uniform at this particular time. And secondly, that there are Southern Baptists who oppose this official stance of the Southern Baptist Church. They did then in 1970. That's why we currently, it was the forces that opposed those early resolutions that ended up gaining prominence in the contemporary representation of Southern Baptists. So you know that there's always internal diversity and tension, healthy tension sometimes destructive tension, but there are always going to be diverse representations of these kinds of questions in any religious tradition. So part of the question is, if we just look for them and wonder about them, then we will find them. And that becomes, again, another opportunity for journalists to not just assume that the official stance of a given leader or of a particular representation of the faith is the only functioning stance in terms of people's theological devotional expressions on the ground. So including some of the most controversial issues, there are advocates for GLBTQ rights in every religious tradition. Sometimes they have to be very underground because their lives are in danger. Sometimes they're very explicit and very easy to find in different social historical contexts, but we rarely recognize or see them to be able to represent those positions. So again, this internal diversity, the evolution and change of positions are really fundamental ways that we hope that people will start to learn to think about how to understand religion. And then finally, this last one, religion's ideologies are embedded in all dimensions of human experience. There's a social science theorist, peace theorist named Johann Galtung, Galtung. In fact, I think I've got him on my next slide here, who helps us understand this concept. I'm not going to go into this because I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. I'm going to do this really briefly, but bear with me for a moment, because this is the framework that helps us understand how religions are embedded. So his entry point here is that he actually has he's a peace theorist, and he has a three-pronged typology of violence and peace that he promoted, because he was trying to ask himself the question, if you have an optimistic view of human nature and capacity, which he does, and that I share, by the way, you have to ask this question: why don't we learn from history? What is it about, if you have an optimistic view and if you don't just assume that humans are prone inevitably to violent interaction, inevitably and consistently, what is it about the dynamics that lend themselves to creating the conditions where we continually reproduce these terrible forms of violence, including following the Holocaust, when the world cry across the globe was never again? But yet, of course, it's happened consistently in many other parts of the world, and well before the Holocaust and well after. So he asked this question: what's going on, basically? What is happening that we continue to reproduce these ideas? So his optimistic view of human nature is represented in what he calls this typology of violence and peace. So he enters with violence, but it has a corollary of peace. And rather than think of violence only in terms of the direct forms of violence, which we associate with violence, with war, maiming, emotional manipulation, bullying, sexual assault, he says that's certainly one form of violence, but it's direct violence. He wants to highlight two other dimensions of violence that are critical for our understanding of this reproduction of violence. The second is structural violence, which is, again, coming out of a Marxist school of thought that is common, not unique to Galtung, but understanding the way that structures, embedded structures of power, end up diminishing the capacity for some people to have access to the goods and services that lead to meaningful existence and give enhance the opportunities for others to engage in those goods and services. So we know that that's classic racism, sexism, heterosexism, all the dimensions of how we understand the roles that those embedded assumptions play in both legal and cultural ways. So structural violence are those inequities, again, that can be technically legal, such as apartheid in South Africa or Jim Crow laws here in the US or anti-Jewish laws in Nazi Germany, but they don't have to be legal. They can also be social, where we have social barriers that can hinder people from actually accessing good health care, good education, where class distinctions then hinder those opportunities. We don't have rules that say some people should have a better education than others, but that factually is, of course, what happens in cultures around the world. So those are structural violence. For Galton, the key here, with the answer to his question about optimistic view of human nature and why we continue to perpetuate these ideas, is what he calls cultural violence. And cultural violence are the embedded ideologies in a given cultural context or worldviews or values, embedded values that make direct and structural forms of violence seem natural or right or good. So again, cultural violence is the embedded ideologies or values in a given society that make structural and direct forms of violence appear to be natural, right, or good. And a quick example, historically it's always easier to see, but his hope is that we'll use this framework to then wonder about our contemporary context. But historically, we can see that several of the cultural forms of violence that came together to give legitimacy to chattel slavery here in the United States, for example. One was religion, where many Christian communities were able to justify the ownership of slaves through their interpretation of the Bible, we've got lots of tracts about that. We've got beliefs, we've got sermons about it, we've got intellectual treatises about it. We also know, by the way, that's cultural violence. Cultural peace, where many Christian communities were involved in leading the abolition movement. So we have then again internal dynamics and tensions within a religious tradition, and we have then the nature of both cultural violence and cultural peace functioning. Another form of cultural violence that gave legitimacy to chattel slavery was the science of phrenology, which was the science of skull sizes, which is now a debunked science, but at the time was a legitimate dimension of biological sciences, where you literally were able to determine considered to be able to determine a person's intellectual capability and cultural capacity through the reading one's skull size and the different ridges in one's skull. And not surprisingly, those with skull sizes and shapes that came out of Western Europe were considered intellectually superior. Those skull sizes and shapes that came out of African contexts were considered intellectually inferior and uncivilized. So science gave legitimacy to direct and structural forms of violence represented in chattel slavery. So for Galton, the power of this is that cultural violence is often unconsciously reproduced, that gives, again, legitimacy to these forms of violence. And his hope is that if we became more conscious of the embedded assumptions and interrogate those assumptions rather than reproduce them unwittingly generation to generation, we would minimize, not ever mitigate, but minimize the forms of direct and structural violence that we continue to perpetuate. Religion always plays a role in a society, and that's one of the ways to understand the ways that religions are embedded in all dimensions of human experience through this typology, because religions always function in forms that promote cultural violence as well as forms that promote cultural peace. And the key would be to look for and interrogate and to see where is religion functioning in any given context around any given issue that we might be wanting to pursue or investigate. So that helps us give a tool to understand the way that religions are embedded, which is a little more difficult to understand than the more self-evident dimensions of distinction between devotional expression and study of diverse devotional expressions. Religions are internally diverse. Religions evolve and change as living traditions. And then this fourth one, religions are embedded in all dimensions of human experience. So those are the tools, and I'm going to back up actually and see if we can get those tools back, so you can see those. And I'm going to stop now and let you and see if what questions you've got.
Thank you. Absolutely. We do have some questions that came in, and I apologize that I had to step away briefly for the delivery that did in fact come, because the universe that works that way while you were having some trouble. But now that we're back on track, Dr. Moore, here's the first question. You mentioned that members of even leaders in a faith group shouldn't be referred to as experts. Is it fair to refer to a scholar of a specific religion as an expert?
I would say it depends on the scholarship. And for most people who would be religious studies scholars, they're going to have to learn both this method, the dimensions of the method that I've got before you, to at least know how to think about a religion. And then also, if you're a scholar of Islam, you're not going to have expertise in Christianity. And even if you're a scholar of Islam, you might have dimensions, but one of the things you will know is that distinction between devotional expression and the study of diverse devotional expressions, and then these fundamental tenets of what it means to understand religion, not from a sectarian lens, but from a non-sectarian perspective.
Okay, and then there are some similar questions that kind of go along the same path. So here's the next one. As journalists, we often turn to religious leaders to assist our understanding, but in doing so, how can we make sure we don't oversimplify a religion news story based on the religious leaders we consult? Who should we ideally be talking to in order to keep that crucial level of nuance?
It's an excellent question and excellently stated. Let me just say that I think that, again, religious leaders can be really wonderful sources on the ground for particular understanding. But even within a community, if you only even remember, you might not even have access to others. But let me just use an example. Most religious leaders, for example, are going to be men. In many parts of the world, still even here in our U.S. context. So there are going to be whole communities of women, and I'm not trying to be essentializing here to say that men have always, by definition, a certain perspective, but socially and culturally, there are going to be what we consider to be valid or representative is often going to be representing, again, different dimensions of power, in this case, in relationship to gender. So you just want to keep in mind to know that if a religious leader is speaking about, especially if he or she speaks vociferously about a particular, this is what we all believe, to just know that there are going to be other more, nuanced perspectives and competing perspectives. And it depends on the story you're doing, but I think even sometimes qualifying, just even a qualification of saying that this leader represents this perspective in a community where there's diverse other perspectives, something like that, I think can do wonders, even if you don't necessarily have access to all those other perspectives, but just to in your own mind, as you're reporting the entirety of the story, to be cognizant of diversity.
Absolutely. So here's another related question to that. If we are to view religious groups and internally diverse and yet religious leaders aren't to be considered experts, at what point are we able to recognize a group or movement as fringe? How do we categorize the Jeff Warrens of the world?
Oh, great. Really, also a good question. I think this issue of fringe is really a good one, because fringe is always contextual. So we tend to use the language fringe as those that we don't like. So we'll use the language of extremism to say, well, we don't like them, they're fringe. I want to just say that there's a whole other dimension of the method that it would not be appropriate to go into today. It's called the cultural studies dimension. And that requires that we also look at questions of social power. So it's rather than say this is fringe and this is central, which by definition, the way we use those terms tend to be then value judgments. I think for journalists and for our collective better understanding of these dynamics, it's another set of questions that would be alternative would be, what is giving rise to this representation in this particular cultural moment, and what makes these other representations marginal? And I think that's an especially relevant question, especially when we're looking at questions of quote unquote extremism. We can, and I'll share my abhorrence of the activities of ISIL and ISIS, for example, and some of the most extreme representations of how they are manifesting their political and religious assertions. But if we don't ask the question, what gives rise to those groups, because if we don't ask what is it that is compelling people to join up with ISIL or ISIS, what gives them legitimacy in the eyes of communities around the world, if we just assume that they're somehow uniquely evil and different from us, which is what happens when we call them terrorists or fringe or extremists, we're not asking a really critical question about the people who are joining them and who are part and parcel of who they are, to say, what's going on here? That would be a Galtung question, because the Galtung framework won't allow us to make them different than us. They won't say you are uniquely somehow other. We have to ask that question, what are the cultural conditions that are giving rise to that make it a compelling alternative for people? And frankly, I don't want to go too far into this, but that's a really important question for us to ask in our current political cycle. And I'll just be explicit here. I'm very, very concerned about the rise of Donald Trump and Ted Cruz. And rather than just denounce them and say what, from my perspective, and say what terrible or people they are, what kind of crazy people, whatever, I'm forced to ask myself, what is going on? What are people who find them compelling? What's happening that gives them cultural legitimacy? And that's a different kind of question, and I think a really important one for us to be asking.
Yeah, I was just posing that question to everyone actually about this election cycle. And I'm sure that from where you sit, Diane, this must be both horrifying and fascinating at the same time to see these platform-based examples of religious illiteracy coming to the forefront. What kind of things do you think the journalists here, what can they do other than write the best, most accurate stories? Is there an answer to combating these just outrageous statements that are now widespread because of this election cycle? What do you think? Oh, and here's another one. I'm going to go ahead. Sean has submitted a question too that I'm sure will be along these lines. How do we contextualize the impact of religious leader endorsements, particularly since the endorsers are often of non-mainline religious traditions where, for example, a lack of national denominational structure matters? I think about megachurch pastors endorsing Donald Trump versus denominational bodies endorsing, for example, Ted Cruz. And he says he may be misremembering Cruz's endorsement. So what do you think about this mess?
Right. Great questions. Let me see if I can do them succinctly. First of all, I think it's really important, as you're saying, to contextualize and to remember that religious support does not mean the fullness of any given community, the denomination itself. So a religious leader might come out with supporting a particular candidate with whatever reason he or she gives, but there'll always be people who will disagree with that. And you might find those people. Like, what would it mean to then report a larger context in terms of what endorsements mean, and to always represent that there are others who aren't being represented in these kind of qualified statements or large-scale endorsements. And then the first one you were asking, Tiffany, I just think this issue of helping to ask that question, ask those deeper questions. I mean, it is fascinating and horrifying. And I'm moving closer, frankly, to the horrifying part recently. In all honesty, I mean, there are real parallels for those students of history around any rise of extreme, leaders who are elected officials in any context of democracy. So other issues that need to be exposed here are really: are we getting the whole story? Are we getting the right story? Who's funding these people? I mean, those are the investigative reporting pieces. Who's really behind the drive for this? And you're one of your colleagues wrote this new book, Dark Money, and her name just escaped me. But that kind of investigative journalism is so important, and then to help not only share that information when it's credible, and I think her work is very credible, but to then help it become disseminated outside of the circles of people who are going to read that book, for example, to help say what's influencing what we perceive to be the truth in our cultural context. who's influencing it, who has the most influence, and what's going on. I think those become really important, nuanced questions that journalists can highlight in any story you do, even if it's a brief line or two.
Excellent. Does anyone have any other questions that you wanted to submit to Dr. Moore as we approach the end of the hour? Anyone typing away? Since I can't see all of you at once. If you do have any further questions, you can feel free to email those to me, and I'll be sure I direct them to Dr. Moore, and I'll post them in the Handa project when we're through here. But otherwise, then I think we'll actually conclude on time today, which is wonderful. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Moore, again for your insights and for sharing your time with us here today. And to all the fellows and the mentors that joined us today, thank you again for joining us. I will have a recording of this available, and I'll post it. I'll share it with you, Dr. Moore, via email, and to everyone else via the Handa Project. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. I'm looking forward to meeting with you again next month.
Great. And just one other final comment before I say thank you as well is that Krista Case Bryant is a journalist who I think is doing some remarkable work. She was the Jerusalem bureau chief recently for the Christian Science Monitor, is currently a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard. And this particular piece you can find on our Religious Literacy Project website, which I've got another slide, and you'll get these slides, so you'll have the link. Where she's highlighting 12 different people in the Israeli-Palestinian context that represent this incredible range of perspectives, challenging the simplistic binary that is so often the case represented in relationship to that conflict. So again, she's just a journalist that I've followed for a long time and really have high respect for. So I wanted to give you a view of someone who I think is doing it well. There are many others, but this is one I wanted to highlight for you. Thank you all for your time. It's been a real pleasure to be with you, and good luck in your important work. And if you do have further follow-up comments, I'm happy to correspond with you. Thanks again, and thank you, Tiffany, for helping make this work, for hosting us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.